What's up, beautiful people? In this video, I will be reviewing Taxation Without Representation. Remember, after 1763, British colonial policies at the end of the French and Indian War will help contribute to the outbreak of the American Revolution. But it's going to take some time. Once the threat of France was removed with the Treaty of Paris, the colonists had less need for Britain. At the same time this was happening, Britain was in serious debt and they passed a series of taxes to help raise revenue. In the British view, the colonists were not holding up their end of the bargain. Not only were they ignoring mercantile laws by smuggling goods, but they were also defying the Proclamation Act of 1763. For the colonies, they had enjoyed years of largely governing their own affairs, and tension increased between Britain and the colonies under Prime Minister George Grenville as he asserted imperial authority over the colonies after the French and Indian War. This painting kind of, though, makes him look like a kind guy. The first source of tension was from the fact that Grenville will actually enforce the mercantile laws that were being ignored by the colonists. In theory, the Navigation Acts required British ships to be used for colonial trade, and certain goods could only be sent to Britain. Prior to the end of the French and Indian War, though, Britain's mercantile policies, such as the Navigation Acts, were rarely enforced. Smuggling and trade with nations they were not supposed to was the norm. The second reason tensions will increase is because new imperial policies were passed that were intended to raise revenue. This is just fancy talk for taxes. These taxes were intended to pay down the debt caused by the war the colonists started, and to help pay for administering this new supersized empire. The Sugar Act, Stamp Act, Townshend Duties, and Tea Act are some examples of these new policies. The point of taxes, such as the Stamp Act, was to raise money to pay for the British troops deployed in the colonies. Thirdly, policies such as the Proclamation Act of 1763 and the Quartering Act of 1765 created widespread resentment amongst the colonists. Remember, the British justified passage of the Proclamation of 1763 as a necessary step to reduce cost and to protect the colonists from attacks by American Indians. The Quartering Act required that colonists provide British soldiers with housing and food. The idea behind the act was that these soldiers were in the colonies defending the colonists. There isn't exactly a Motel 6 or an Airbnb available, therefore you best believe Britain was going to expect the colonists to shoulder some of the burden. All of these actions by Britain sparked discussions in the colonies over whether or not these policies were justified. Resistance will develop, and resistance to British colonial policy was inspired by a number of factors. One, ideas of the Enlightenment inspired new ways of thinking about the rights of the individual and the rights of British subjects. Beyond just anger over having to pay up was the fact that these taxes were passed without direct colonial representation or consent. Those opposed to these British policies pointed to the fact that the colonists did not have representation in Parliament. For them, the slogan became, "No taxation without representation." The idea was this: if we, the colonists, don't have representation in Parliament, you can't tax us. The colonists felt these new taxes and enforcement of existing laws not only violated their political rights, but also constrained their economic development. You might recall, under a mercantile system, the British do not want colonial manufacturing to develop. One of the principles of mercantilism was that the colonists should purchase manufactured goods from Britain and send certain raw materials only to Britain. These ideas were largely the result of various Enlightenment thinkers who stated individuals have natural rights and that there were limits to government power. The colonists saw themselves as English citizens. Yeah, they lived on the other side of the pond, but felt they should have all the same rights as Englishmen in London. So one factor influencing colonial resistance to British policy was the influence of the Great Awakening and the Enlightenment, which inspired people to question authority and stress the rights of individuals. The second factor inspiring resistance to British colonial policy was the tradition of self-rule the colonies enjoyed. The colonies had their own colonial governments and were accustomed to doing as they pleased. The British had another view, though. In response to these colonial protests, the two Jocz said the colonists had what was called virtual representation. Basically said Parliament represented all British subjects, and this included the colonists, who were considered British subjects as well. In the minds of the Jocz, Parliament passed laws with the colonists' interest in mind. They expected the colonists to fulfill their obligations as members of the British Empire. But after 1763, it became increasingly obvious that Britain and the colonies had fundamentally different interests. Colonial protests took a variety of forms, but the movement to independence was slow to develop. One of the challenges was the fact that the colonists are from different regions, have different interests, and have no shared history of working together. A lot of the taxes imposed by Britain mostly impacted merchants in the New England region or colonists in urban areas. It was hard to get all the colonists to care about the colonial cause. Even when the American Revolution finally happens in 1776, nearly 1/3 of the colonists are going to remain loyal to Britain, with about 40% not really caring who wins or loses. Nevertheless, there were slow steps towards greater colonial unity as the 13 colonies came together to resist British policies. The Stamp Act Congress brought together representatives from 9 colonies, and they demanded the Stamp Act be repealed. The Stamp Act was particularly hated since it increased the price of all legal and business documents, and eventually, as a result of a lot of different forms of protest, the Stamp Act would be repealed in 1766. The Stamp Act Congress would be followed by the Committee of Correspondence. The Committee of Correspondence formed after the Boston Massacre in order to keep up the resistance to British policies. This was the colony's means for maintaining communication lines in the years before the Revolutionary War. And in response to the Intolerable Acts, the First Continental Congress was called into session in Philadelphia in 1774. Like the other intercolonial meetings, the First Continental Congress would seek to band the colonies together in protest to British imperial policies. Every colony except Georgia would meet up in Philly in 1774, and they would agree to call for an embargo on Britain. But it's important you keep in mind, often at these meetings were members of the colonial elite. These individuals are focusing on the rights of citizens, the proper role of government, and other philosophical Enlightenment ideas. And at these meetings, there was no unified calls for independence. Even when the Continental Congress met in 1774, most delegates were about getting their grievances addressed, not declaring independence. In addition to these official colonial meetings, organizations such as the Sons of Liberty and Daughters of Liberty banded colonists together in resistance to British policies in the 1760s and 70s. In these groups, working class men and women became involved in colonial politics, often for the first time. One of the most effective methods of resistance organized by these groups were the non-importation agreements. These boycotts were an economic way to make a political statement. Basically, we're not going to buy from you, Britain. Essential to the success was the fact that all sorts of different social classes participated in these economic boycotts. Women played a role in the resistance to British policies as well. Making homemade goods instead of buying them from the British was a political act as they were producing goods for the patriot cause. And some protests in the colonies even took on more radical tactics. In response to both the Stamp Act and Tea Act, physical acts of protest included threats and violence against royal officials, destruction of property, mob protests, and even tar and feathering of British officials. Even though the actual events of the Boston Massacre were much more complicated, the event was used as colonial propaganda against the British. Most famously, Paul Revere's engraving portrayed what happened as poor colonists being purposely gunned down by British soldiers. Another example of more radical forms of protest can be seen with the Boston Tea Party, the actions of some members of the Sons of Liberty dumping the private property of the British East India Tea Company into Boston Harbor was even condemned by some colonists as going too far. Heavens forbid, not the private property. In response to the Boston Tea Party, Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, or as the colonists called them, the Intolerable Acts. These acts did a variety of things to punish the colonies, such as closing the port of Boston and shutting down the Massachusetts legislature. These acts by the British inspired the colonists to call into session the First Continental Congress. The big idea, though, is this. One consequence of Britain asserting imperial authority over the colonists was to begin to unite the colonists against their mama. Opposition to British policies will increase intercolonial unity. These 13 colonies that had relatively little in common will slowly work together to question and challenge British policies. There is a lot going down in the 12 years between the end of the French and Indian War and the first shots of the American Revolution at Lexington and Concord. So one more time for people in the cheap seats. The effort for American independence took time to develop. Energizing the calls for American independence were colonial leaders such as Benjamin Franklin. In addition, the political activism of laborers, artisans, and women helped boost support for independence. These ideas inspired some colonial leaders to resist British policy. And in our next video, I will examine the philosophical foundations of the American Revolution. What were all these people thinking as they were doing the doing? Until next time, thank you so much for watching this Jocz Productions video. Have a beautiful day. Peace.